Hello and welcome. You're watching Bloomberg Quint Live. Now, in phase one of his Asian odyssey, US President Trump has sent a mixed message to Japan. Today, Donald Trump urged Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to purchase US military equipment to create jobs in America, but Trump complained to Japan's business leaders that Japan has an unfair advantage on trade. He also said that few American cars are sold in Japan and made a plea to Japanese automakers to build more in the US. In a joint press briefing with Abe in Tokyo on Monday, Trump hailed the US-Japan alliance, even as he called for a reduction in the trade gap between the two countries. He said that the time for strategic patience with North Korea is over. Japan's Prime Minister Abe announced that he will freeze the assets of the 35 North Korean groups and individuals as a new sanction on North Korea. Abe also pitched that China should harden its stance against North Korea, as well as Trump. Trump is on the first stop of a five-nation swing through Asia, where he plans to push his message of fair trade. Now, just to tell you about what his itinerary is like, we'll take you through the trip on this wall behind us. Well, obviously, on November 5th, he landed in Tokyo, and, we'll get you updates from that trip as well. But he moves on then to Seoul on the 7th of November, where, that's one part of the trip that's keenly awaited. He then proceeds from Seoul to Beijing on November 8th. That's the one-year anniversary since the US presidential elections. And then, of course, after that key moment in Beijing, he heads to Hanoi, Vietnam. That's on November 11th. And that's not all, because he ends his Asia trip in Manila on November 12th. Now, to understand what all of this means, we're joined by Dhruva Jaishankar. He's going to discuss the wider implications of Trump's Asia visit. Dhruva is, of course, a fellow for foreign policy at Brookings India. Dhruva, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. We're also going to be joined in a bit by Christopher Johnson, Senior Advisor and Freeman Chair at CSIS. Now, Dhruva, I'd like to start by asking you, while we were expecting a lot more action on the deal front, there weren't any major announcements when it comes to trade with the Japan leg of the trip. Would you say Trump's Asian odyssey is off to a tepid start?
Well, I think we have to see sort of what the purpose of this trip was. I think there's several objectives here. Trade and jobs is one, and obviously one that's been getting attention, but I think it's only one objective. A second is a sort of reassurance trip in terms of U.S. alliances in the region, particularly Japan and South Korea, and to some degree the Philippines. And it's about ensuring the terms of that relationship moving forward. So I think that's the second element of it. A third, I think, will be very interesting to see what happens in China in particular, and particularly this being the first major meeting after Xi Jinping's consolidation of power in Beijing. Following the last party congress, the kind of rapport between Trump and Xi. And finally, I think that the message that the Trump administration is trying to stress is a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I'd be in particular watch out for the speech that he will give in Vietnam, which will outline in some ways the broader contours of his Asia policy. So I think these are the broad objectives, and I think the Japan leg of the visit that we've seen so far is very much in line with that. We have seen a strong commitment to the alliance. But at the same time, we've also seen issues about rebalancing the trade and bringing jobs to America.
Right, Dhruva, we're also joined in this chat, of course, with Christopher Johnson. He's the Senior Advisor and Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. Christopher, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quint. My first question to Dhruva is something that I want to pose to you as well, considering that this is Donald Trump's longest foreign trip since he took office, obviously. And considering what happened in Japan over the last couple of days, would you say that we've started the trip on a sort of tepid note?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if tepid's the right note, but what strikes me about it is that it is very much emblematic of the bifurcated policy that we've seen out of the administration so far. And on the security side, we see a regular effort to emphasize alliances. In any given administration, there's always that tension between whether to manage China from the so-called outside in, emphasizing alliance relationships and so on, and using those to manage Chinese behavior, or from the inside out, which is more the sort of G2 or sort of grand bargain notion that's been discussed. I think it's fair to say that we've seen all versions of that from the administration. When we look at the initial summit between Xi Jinping and President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, we saw some flavors of that. We've since seen more of an emphasis with free and open Indo-Pacific toward the alliances, the sort of outside-in strategy. And I think they just haven't made up their mind, and this makes it, much simpler for China. And then I think, you see this tension between the trade piece and the security piece. And so here we are with an ally in Japan. One day it's golf and burgers and making the alliance even greater, and then the next day it's you're terrible on trade. And I think this really sends mixed messages and in some ways makes China's job easier.
Right, Christopher, and also considering, we were actually detailing Donald Trump's entire trip on the wall behind us on the show. Considering he will be moving to Beijing later, and of course South Korea is his next stop, how do you and considering that the main focus of this trip has been North Korea, how do you think Trump's approach will be tweaked for the other countries that he weeks in the course of the other countries that he meets in the course of the week?
I think that very much remains to be seen. Seoul is very critical. I think there the main focus for the president has to be on reassuring the South Koreans that whatever intentions we may have toward, especially in the space of potential military action against North Korea, we're very much in lockstep with them and discussing that. It's not by coincidence that right after the Party Congress concluded, Xi Jinping moves immediately to mend fences with Seoul, also reaches out to North Korea through a response to a congratulatory letter on the Party Congress to sort of maximize his options in terms of dialogue with the two parties before President Trump gets there. And that obviously was very deliberate. So I think Seoul, Japan, the region, they're all looking very much at shall we say, President Trump's attitudinal setting in terms of what message he's going to send to Seoul about the strength of their alliance and about our view of them as an integral partner in the approach toward North Korea.
Right, Christopher. Also, Dhruva, I want to pose my next question to you. Now, considering November 8th marks the anniversary of the US elections, that's the last time you and I had a big chat in Delhi. But this year, it's perhaps the biggest day of Trump's Asia tour, and it's with Xi Jinping in China. And this is after, of course, like Christopher was mentioning, that the Chinese leader has firmly cemented his leadership. Now, apart from seeking a harder line on North Korea, what do you think we could expect? Will he pitch for increased access for American tech companies to part of China's economy especially?
I think what we'll see in China when the two leaders meet, there will be a lot of nice words said and all of that. I think we can expect a certain element of cordiality, and the red carpet will be pulled out for Trump. On the other hand, I think we have been seeing a very strong hardening of the administration's policy towards China. As was mentioned earlier, we have seen a pretty significant shift towards the outside-in policy, and that includes in some ways frustrations on the trade side of a similar nature to what we've seen in Japan. And just a few indicators of this: the Trump administration has been more frequent in its use of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, the appointments of some key individuals to positions in the White House and the Department of Defense. Also underline or indicate that might be the case. The growing frustrations with Beijing over its lack of leverage with North Korea. Trump has taken to Twitter to publicly call out China on this. And then we saw Rex Tillerson give a speech a few weeks ago, now ostensibly on India before his visit to India, but really which was quite a strong statement against China's broader regional policy, One Belt, One Road, and also its economic policy. So if you take all of this together, I think despite what we will see in Beijing, and we will see, I think, a lot of the pomp and ceremony expected of this kind of a visit of this importance. At the same time, I think what I really watch out for is what happens after that, and particularly the statements that come out of Trump in Vietnam.
Right, Dhruva. Also, Chris, I'd love to pose that question to you as well. It's all this while it's been about America first, but we haven't seen any clear articulation of that policy per se, and especially when it comes to Asia and this Asia visit for Donald Trump. And I'm actually pinpointing the China leg of this visit. Do you think that we're going to see some sort of articulation of that America First policy? And it's interesting considering especially how Xi Jinping has been talking about China first and his thoughts on socialism.
Right. Yeah, no, I think we will see that. I think it's going to probably largely happen behind the scenes. And I think what we've been witnessing just in the last few days or week is a deliberate effort by China to use the summit as a means to sort of press the reset button, if you will, in the relationship, especially on these issues of trade. I think they have real concerns that the USTR, Robert Lighthizer, seems to be sort of in the driver's seat now in the pole position on trade approach. They're worried about that. I think the Chinese understand pretty clearly that, again, probably privately, although President Trump can always surprise us, he will sort of indicate to them on some of these key issues, I'm coming after you on trade. And so it's, the ability of China, if you will, to be able to do enough, and this, works for North Korea as well, but especially on trade, to kind of get that reset. And then I think if they don't feel like they've gotten that, I think we'll see a harder edge from them. Something I hear repeatedly when I'm there is, we were willing to tolerate a lot of these things in the context of maintaining stable relations for the party Congress. That's now over. Xi Jinping is in this more powerful position, and therefore, we want smooth and stable relations and predictable relations. If you make that difficult for us, we're going to push back. And I think so. They're kind of on this fulcrum, and that makes it an important litmus test of the visit. And how the president decides to send the messages, public, private, the tone, and so on, will be very important.
Right, and another thing I want to talk about is one key word, considering his Asia visit, is the TPP. Now, later this week, Trump heads to Vietnam and the Philippines, where he will be taking part in the ASEAN summit. And there's going to be a lot of TPP members there. That was a conference which he was apparently going to skip in the first place. But now that the White House has confirmed it, Dhruva, do you think that's going to be an awkward dinner table conversation, considering he'll be sitting across the table with the very members of the TPP, a deal that he junked at the beginning of his tenure?
I think he's made that very clear. He couches it in terms, Trump couches it in terms of that he's against multilateral trade agreements and he thinks he can get better terms in bilateral trade agreements. But he's been quite firm about that. It's something he did off the bat after his inauguration. What the future holds for TPP and for U.S. trade policy in the region, I think, is a little bit up in the air as a result of all of that. In my view, and I think that's shared by a lot of people, it is a big self-goal for the United States. I think there is some talk, particularly led by Japan, about exploring the possibility of a TPP minus America, and whether that would really be valuable. It has been negotiated, has been ratified by the Japanese government, and certainly countries like Vietnam are still keen on something like TPP. But at the same time, it's also consistent with his message about trying to get better deals and reduce the trade deficit with countries. And in a lot of the planning in the lead up to these visits, the Trump administration has been asking leaders, what are you going to say? What deals can you announce to show that you are doing something to right-size the trade relationship? So, for example, even with India, in the lead up to Trump's meeting with Modi a few months ago, what really made an impact on him was the fact that SpiceJet, of all things, that SpiceJet was buying a large number of Boeing aircraft. And that India was planning on buying some defense equipment from the U.S. And this seemed to assuage Trump's belief that India was taking this seriously, the trade deficit. So I think the expectation on the White House's part is to see announcements like that over the course of this trip. How many will be forthcoming remains to be seen. But for a lot of the countries in the region, and that includes all 11 TPP partners, the United States remains a very major economic partner, and that I think cannot be forgotten.
Right, Dhruva. It's interesting you brought up that point, and I want to ask Chris the next question. Christopher, it's kind of interesting because while Trump did actually, make a plea to Japanese automakers to really manufacture in the U.S., I was just going through some statistics, and it turns out that those Japanese OEMs, the Japanese automakers, are actually, 3/4 of their production line is actually in the U.S. when it comes to the American market. So those are mixed signals going out from the president.
I think that's true, and I think that that underlines a more sort of fundamental problem that my colleague was just highlighting, which is that, in the context of the administration's stated preferred approach, which is these bilateral agreements, how do you explain to a country like Japan, massive economy, that we need the bilateral FTA when it's actually differences over specific sectors, autos, agriculture, and so on, that seem to be the rub in most of our discussions? And so I think a lot of our foreign partners are left scratching their heads and sort of saying, well, why don't we just work on the sectoral issues independently, that are generating the problems? In other words, it's hard convincing, especially an economy the size of Japan's, that the bilateral FTA is either necessary or the right road. And just a word on TPP, I think, the main issue is this whole absence of a counter narrative. If you don't have a strong counter narrative like TPP that was based on standards and so on, that highlights the deficiencies in China's system and the Chinese model, then suddenly things like President Xi's sort of notion in his speech that China has indeed found a third way somewhere between socialism and capitalism that's working, starts to ring more true if you don't have, a proper counter narrative to deal with them.
Right, it's also interesting, Christopher, because while we are talking about some of the key issues that would be addressed on this trip, another one seems to be the South China Sea. And while we haven't seen any articulation of America's take on that dispute, that is something that plagues the region, be it Japanese and Filipino sailors, being caught out there or, being embroiled in some sort of a conflict, and also China asserting that it is their territory. Is that something that would be on the agenda and something on the cards for this trip for Donald Trump?
I would hope so. As my colleague pointed out, I think one thing that's not really that widely known is the increase in the tempo of freedom of navigation operations in the region. There is something of a sort of, don't talk about it, just do it sort of strategy. I think the Chinese, basically their play in this has been, they tested early on with some behavior in the East China Sea where there was some disputing over the Senkakus early in Xi Jinping's tenure, both the strength of the alliance commitment and Prime Minister Abe's mettle, if you will, and they found both to be pretty solid. Then they looked at the South China Sea and perhaps saw more of a soft underbelly, a lot less coordination, less of a U.S. Sort of strong stance in that issue. And so, especially given in light of the fact that Xi Jinping, in his work report to the 19th Party Congress, chose to single out the island building that China's been doing in the South China Sea as a positive, as an achievement of his first 5 years, it strikes me then that President Trump probably has to say something, not just privately, but publicly, to counterbalance that and reassure the region.
Right, Dhruva, as a last question to you, I'd also like to talk to you about, the Philippines leg of this Asian trip for Donald Trump. Now, President Duterte's human rights record has been criticized as his country wages war against drug dealers and users. As a result, it had been rumored in Washington that Trump would actually skip the ASEAN summit happening in Manila. Now that he is attending, I wanted to ask you, does that mean that he'd have some sort of, is that what's expected, that he'd have a very strong take when it comes to especially human rights violations in the region?
I'm not sure human rights violations are really high on the agenda of this administration in the United States. So we may very well not see that brought up. And of course, there are parallels that have been drawn between President Duterte and President Trump, at least in their personal styles and mannerisms. But I think one of the things that has, as a consequence of some of the shunning of Duterte, we have seen in some ways a very sort of a more consolidated relationship between China and the Philippines taking hold over the last year or two, and a pouring in of Chinese investment, particularly into places like Davao, which is in the southern city, which is Duterte's political constituency. But I think one of the things that's interesting is this year we saw the takeover of a city, Marawi, in southern Philippines, by Islamic State-backed affiliated militants. And in fact, it was U.S. Special Operations Forces that actually helped to free the city of this group. And I think what that indicated was, despite all of this talk of the Philippines gravitating more towards China, particularly economically, it was still the relationship with the United States under Duterte still mattered a lot, and particularly for security reasons. So I think what we will see, I think the commonalities highlighted over the differences when Trump goes to the Philippines.
All right, Dhruva, as a last question, Christopher, I just wanted to ask you, especially considering China, and I know that's a subject you've been tracking very closely over the years, could we expect some sort of a softened stance when it comes to China, as opposed to the aggressive stance that we had originally predicted by Donald Trump?
I think that's certainly possible, but I think the energy, if you will, especially again, sort of as embodied in this notion of the free and open Indo-Pacific, is toward the other direction, is toward a scratchier policy toward China. And administrations always have to find their footing on this. Oftentimes the instinct is early in the administration to adopt a sort of tougher stance, and then over time they realize the constraints of the bilateral relationship, and you find a more cooperative relationship coming toward the end. I would argue the previous administration, the Obama administration, kind of flipped that around and overcorrected in terms of being too solicitous of China early on, and then had to make the appropriate counterbalancing moves later, which left the relationship on sort of a sour note. I mean, one problem that I think we face is that, as we've seen in Japan on this trip, the president can speak out of several different sides of his mouth at any one given time, and so it's difficult for countries to get a good feel of where is this person. And I think, for China in particular, but it's true of all Asian states, what they really want at the end of the day is consistency and predictability out of the U.S. They're willing to tolerate some pushback on some of their key initiatives if they believe the person is reliable at the end of the day. I think this was one of George W. Bush's most outstanding achievements in terms of his Asian policy, and I worry that we're not seeing that consistency with President Trump thus far.
Right, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us from DC. Dhruva, we appreciate you joining us from New Delhi, and all of you tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. Of course, this is your one-stop shop for everything from Trump's Asia visit over the course of the week. Stay tuned to Bloomberg Quint.